A 6-ton African bull elephant can flip a safari vehicle with its forehead. It can uproot a full-grown acacia tree with its trunk, snapping wood that a human could not dent with an axe. It can outrun a person over short distances, moving 3,000 kilograms per leg at a speed that closes gaps faster than most people can process what is happening. By every measure of raw physical dominance on land, the African elephant has no equal. Nothing alive today is larger. Nothing alive today is stronger. And yet, in 2007, a television crew working with the show Mythbusters traveled to a private game reserve in the Limpopo province of South Africa to test one of the oldest, most persistent claims in the history of natural science. They buried a white mouse under a ball of fresh elephant dung, rigged a line to roll the dung away at the precise moment an elephant walked past, and waited. The elephant approached the path, the dung rolled aside, the mouse sat exposed on the red dirt for a fraction of a second, then moved. And the elephant, all 6,000 kilograms of it, stopped mid-stride. It did not charge. It did not stomp. It shifted its enormous body sideways and walked a wide, deliberate arc around the 20-gram animal sitting in the dust, an animal roughly the weight of 4 nickels. The crew reset the experiment. A different elephant approached. Same result. The animal noticed the small creature near its feet, hesitated, and chose to walk around. They classified the myth as plausible. So why would an animal that weighs not 100 times more than a mouse, as the common claim suggests, but 300,000 times more, an animal whose brain is the largest of any creature currently walking the earth, show any response at all to something that small? The answer reaches back 60 million years into the Proboscidean fossil record. It involves a sensory system so refined that it makes human perception look crude by comparison. And it has almost nothing to do with mice. How does an animal with no natural predators in adulthood, an animal that has dominated every terrestrial ecosystem it has occupied for tens of millions of years, develop a fear response so sensitive that a 20-gram rodent can trigger it? The answer begins with a contradiction. The very trait that makes elephants dominant, their extraordinary size, is the same trait that makes them vulnerable in ways no smaller animal has to worry about. And the response that looks absurd when a mouse triggers it is actually one of the most sophisticated survival systems that evolution has ever assembled. To see why, you have to understand something about the way an elephant experiences the world, because an elephant does not see what you see. It does not hear what you hear. And it evaluates threats through a brain that operates on principles so different from a human's that researchers spent decades misreading the data before they understood what was really going on. The idea that elephants fear mice is ancient. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and military commander who spent the last decades of his life cataloging the known world in obsessive detail, addressed the claim directly in his Naturalis Historia, published in 77 AD. Across 37 volumes covering everything from the movements of the stars to the behavior of insects, Pliny devoted considerable attention to elephants. He described them as the largest of all land creatures and the nearest to man in intelligence, an assessment that modern neuroscience has, somewhat remarkably, largely confirmed. He wrote about their memory, their capacity for affection, their ability to learn complex commands. And then he wrote that the elephant hates the mouse above all other creatures, and that if an elephant discovers a mouse has touched its fodder, it will refuse to eat. The claim embedded itself in Western knowledge and stayed there for nearly 2,000 years. Medieval bestiaries repeated it without question, often illustrating the pairing with elaborate woodcuts showing comically tiny mice standing before towering elephants. Renaissance scholars cited it as established zoological fact. By the time Walt Disney animated Dumbo in 1941, showing an elephant cowering at the sight of a tiny mouse perched on a hay bale, the image had become cultural bedrock, something everybody knew and almost nobody thought to question. But Pliny was working from second-hand sources. Most of his informants were Roman soldiers and merchants who had encountered war elephants in the armies of Carthage and the Hellenistic kingdoms, or who had watched elephants perform in Roman arena spectacles. Their observations were filtered through military contexts, exotic animal exhibitions, and the general Roman appetite for dramatic stories about foreign beasts. Pliny also claimed, in the same encyclopedia, that elephants worship the moon and that they can be made drunk on fermented rice wine until they become cooperative. His track record on zoological accuracy was, to put it generously, mixed. The question that persisted for 2 millennia was never whether Pliny got the details right. It was whether something real was buried beneath the exaggeration. And the Mythbusters test in that Limpopo game reserve, imperfect and uncontrolled as it was, suggested the answer was yes. The elephants did react. They did avoid. Something was driving the response. To understand what, you need to start with the elephant's eyes. An African elephant's eye measures roughly 4 centimeters in diameter, about the size of a large walnut. For an animal that stands nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, taller than most single-story houses in a typical suburban neighborhood, that is a remarkably small piece of optical hardware. A thoroughbred racehorse, which weighs barely a tenth of what a bull elephant weighs, has proportionally much larger eyes. An ostrich, at just over 100 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large man, has the largest eyes of any land animal alive, each one nearly 5 centimeters across, and built specifically for sharp, long-distance resolution in the flat, open grasslands of Africa. The elephant did not evolve for visual precision. Its eyes sit on the sides of its head, wide apart, providing a panoramic field of peripheral vision stretching roughly 300 degrees around the animal's body. That is useful for detecting movement across a wide area. But the trade-off is poor binocular overlap directly in front, which means depth perception at close range is limited. The elephant can detect large shapes. It can track motion against a contrasting background. But fine detail at ground level, particularly small stationary objects directly beneath it or near its feet, is not something its visual system was designed to resolve with confidence. Field biologists working with elephants across East and Southern Africa have observed for decades that elephants frequently fail to notice stationary objects at ground level until those objects move. A leopard tortoise sitting motionless on a well-worn game trail will often be stepped over or walked past without any visible acknowledgement. But the same tortoise, if it retracts its head quickly into its shell, producing a sudden small movement near the elephant's foot, will trigger a visible startle and a course correction. The implication for the mouse question is direct. When a mouse appears near an elephant's foot, the elephant does not perceive a mouse. It perceives an unidentified small object that moved. It cannot tell from visual information alone whether that object is a harmless rodent, a scorpion, a puff adder coiled in dry grass, or a particularly aggressive dung beetle. And when the visual channel delivers ambiguous information about a small, fast-moving object near one of the most vulnerable parts of its body, the elephant does what any intelligent animal confronting ambiguity near a critical structure does. It steps aside and reassesses. But vision is only one of the sensory channels an elephant uses to evaluate its environment. And for elephants, it is not even close to the most important one. In 2014, geneticist Yoshihito Nimura at the University of Tokyo published a landmark study in the journal Genome Research that mapped the olfactory receptor gene families across 13 mammalian species. The study was methodical, comparing the genomes of animals from horses to rodents to primates to carnivores. When the analysis was complete, one species sat in a category entirely its own. The African elephant possesses approximately 1,948 functional olfactory receptor genes. That is more than any other mammal ever studied, more than the domestic dog, which has been celebrated for millennia as the gold standard of mammalian smell and carries roughly 811 functional olfactory receptor genes, more than the laboratory rat, with about 1,207, more than twice as many as any primate, nearly 5 times what a human being possesses. Nimura's team concluded that this massive expansion of the elephant's olfactory gene family likely reflects both the critical ecological importance of smell and elephant survival and a long series of gene duplication events that accumulated across tens of millions of years as the proboscidean lineage diversified across Africa, Asia, and, historically, Europe and the Americas. The delivery mechanism for all this olfactory capability is the trunk, and the trunk is an organ that defies casual description. It contains over 40,000 individual muscle fascicles, which is more than exist in the entire human body combined. It can detect a single molecule of a volatile compound drifting on the wind from several kilometers away, a distance you could walk in 40 minutes at a brisk pace. Elephants use their trunks to locate underground water sources by pressing the tip against dry soil and sampling the chemical gradient seeping upward from below. They can identify the reproductive status of another elephant from a urine deposit left on a trail hours earlier. They can recognize individual family members by scent alone, distinguishing relatives from strangers with a chemical precision that rivals fingerprint identification. When a small animal appears near an elephant, the elephant does not rely on its eyes to make the identification. It reaches its trunk toward the ground and samples the air. And this is where the story shifts into unexpected territory. Because the strongest avoidance responses in elephants are triggered not by what they see but by what they smell. The creatures that register as most dangerous on the elephant's olfactory radar are, paradoxically, among the smallest animals on the entire African savanna. In 2007, the same year the Mythbusters crew was testing white mice in Limpopo, a doctoral researcher named Lucy King was working with the University of Oxford and the conservation organization Save the Elephants in the dry, thorny scrubland of the Samburu National Reserve in northern Kenya. King had noticed something that the local Samburu and Maasai pastoralist communities had known and talked about for generations, but that Western science had never formally documented under controlled experimental conditions. African elephants were terrified of honeybees. Not mildly cautious around them, not slightly annoyed when stung, genuinely, viscerally flee the area terrified. King designed an experiment that was elegant in its simplicity. She placed wireless speakers inside artificial tree logs along known elephant pathways and played two recordings. One was the sound of a disturbed colony of African honeybees, Apis mellifera scutellata, the aggressive subspecies found across sub-Saharan Africa. The other was white noise, carefully calibrated to match the same frequency range and volume level. When the white noise played, the elephants paid no attention and continued walking, browsing, feeding, as if nothing had changed. When the bee recording played, the elephants fled. Not hesitated, fled. Within 10 seconds of hearing the sound of a disturbed bee colony, family groups of elephants turned away from the speaker and moved rapidly, often at a near run, in the opposite direction. And as they moved, many of them produced a distinctive low-frequency rumble that King had not encountered in any previous catalog of elephant vocalizations. A sound the elephants made only in response to bees, a dedicated alarm call for a specific insect threat. King published the results in the journal Current Biology. The paper demonstrated not only that elephants had an intense fear response to bees, but that they possessed a unique, purpose-built acoustic warning for the threat. A signal transmitted at low frequencies that carried across the herd and coordinated a group-wide retreat within seconds. The follow-up studies expanded the picture in ways that made the original finding look like a footnote. King and her team documented that elephants shook their heads vigorously while fleeing from bee sounds, a behavior entirely consistent with trying to dislodge insects from the sensitive skin around the eyes and ears. They found that elephants avoided entire geographic areas where active beehives were present, abandoning rich grazing and browsing opportunities rather than risk contact with the colony. And they discovered something that changed the interpretation of the fear response entirely. It was not a simple reflex, it was learned. Younger elephants showed noticeably weaker responses than older ones. Herds led by experienced matriarchs, females over 40 years old carrying decades of accumulated threat knowledge, responded faster, organized their retreats more efficiently, and kept their calves more tightly clustered than herds led by younger, less experienced females. The bee fear was being transmitted culturally, from mother to calf, across elephant generations. A young elephant did not need to be stung to develop the avoidance response. It needed to watch its mother run. King took the research into practical territory. She developed the beehive fence, a system of interconnected beehives suspended from wire strung between simple wooden posts. Installed along the borders of small-scale farms in elephant country across Kenya and Tanzania. When an elephant pushed against the wire while attempting to raid crops at night, the hives swung on their hooks, the bees poured out, and the elephant backed away. Field trials showed the system reduced crop raiding by roughly 80%. It protected farmers, it protected elephants, which are often killed in retaliation for crop damage, and it provided the communities with honey as a secondary income source. But the deeper implication of King's work mattered more than any fence. An individual African honeybee weighs approximately 1/10 of a gram. A large bull elephant weighs 6,000 kilograms. The mass ratio between them is not 100 to 1, the figure casually tossed around in the title of this video. The ratio between an elephant and a single bee is approximately 60 million to 1. And a bee triggers a more intense, more organized, and more culturally entrenched fear response than virtually any other animal the elephant encounters in its natural habitat, including lions. I mean, think about that for a second. 60 million to 1, and the smaller creature wins the standoff every single time. The reason has nothing to do with pain tolerance or fragility. It has everything to do with where the damage lands. African elephant skin is thick. Across the flanks, the back, and the upper legs, it ranges from 2.5 to 4 centimeters deep, roughly the thickness of a hardcover novel. Dense enough to stop most insect stings. Dense enough to deflect thorns from acacia branches that would shred thinner-skinned animals. Dense enough, in confrontations with predators, to absorb claw strikes and even minor puncture attempts without causing serious injury. But the skin is not uniformly thick. Behind the ears, around the eyes, inside the mouth, along the inner surface of the trunk, and in the soft tissue around the genitals, the thickness drops dramatically. In some of these areas, the skin is less than a millimeter deep. The lining inside the trunk, in particular, is delicate mucosal tissue, densely woven with nerve endings, blood vessels, and sensory receptors. It is, in terms of vulnerability, almost the exact opposite of the armored hide covering the rest of the body. A bee sting on thick flank skin is meaningless. The elephant may not even register it. A bee sting inside the trunk, where the tissue is thin and the nerve density is among the highest anywhere on the animal's body, produces intense localized pain and swelling. A swarm of 100 bees targeting the eyes, the nostrils, and the ear canal simultaneously can cause tissue inflammation severe enough to impair the elephant's vision, hearing, and ability to breathe, all at the same time. And because the trunk is the organ the elephant depends on for eating, drinking, breathing, social communication, and physical defense, anything that compromises trunk function threatens the animal's ability to survive. Veterinary researchers and wildlife veterinarians working across East Africa have documented rare but confirmed cases of young elephants dying after sustained bee attacks in the wild. The deaths were caused not by cumulative venom dosage but by anaphylactic responses and asphyxiation when the mucosal lining of the trunk and throat swelled shut. For an animal that cannot breathe through its mouth the way a human can, a blocked trunk is not an injury. It is a death sentence. This is the insight that transforms the entire question about elephant fear. Elephants do not assess threats based on size. They assess threats based on cost. The calculation is never, is this creature large enough to hurt me? The calculation is, can this creature reach the places where my defenses are thinnest? And for an animal whose most vital organ is an externally exposed tube of thin, nerve-rich mucosal tissue hanging from the front of its face, the list of creatures capable of inflicting genuine damage includes a surprising number of very small animals. And then there are the feet. An elephant's foot is a structure so precisely engineered that it took decades of anatomical study before researchers fully understood what it was doing. The bones are arranged in a semi-digitigrade posture, meaning the elephant walks on the tips of its toes, not on the flat of its sole, with a thick pad of fibrous fatty tissue cushioning every step. That pad distributes the animal's weight, roughly 500 kilograms per foot on a 6-ton individual, across a contact area of about 40 by 50 centimeters, an area slightly larger than a standard dinner plate. But the fat pad is not just a shock absorber, it is a sensory organ of extraordinary sensitivity. In 2001, biologist Caitlin O'Connell Rodwell at Stanford University published the first in a series of landmark studies that fundamentally changed how science understood elephant communication. Working at Etosha National Park in the sparse, sun-bleached landscape of northern Namibia, O'Connell Rodwell demonstrated that elephants detect seismic vibrations through their feet. The fat pad is densely packed with Pacinian corpuscles, the same category of mechanoreceptor that allows your fingertips to feel the texture of fabric or the edge of a coin. In elephants, these receptors are tuned to frequencies between 10 and 40 Hz, which corresponds precisely to the frequency range of elephant infrasonic vocalizations, calls pitched too low for the human ear to detect. O'Connell Rodwell showed that elephants can detect the footsteps of other elephants from distances exceeding 30 kilometers, roughly the length of the island of Manhattan measured 3 times over. They can distinguish between the seismic signature of a familiar herd member and a stranger at distances where airborne sound has long since dissipated into silence. They can pick up ground vibrations produced by distant thunderstorms from over 100 kilometers away, farther than the distance between Philadelphia and New York City, and begin moving toward the anticipated rainfall before a single cloud is visible on the horizon. This is where the mouse reaction becomes something other than a joke. The same sensitivity that allows an elephant to feel a family member's rumble through the ground from 30 kilometers away also means that any unexpected vibration near the footpad registers immediately as a signal demanding attention. A mouse scurrying across dry earth near an elephant's foot generates a seismic disturbance that the Pacinian corpuscles detect instantly. The signal is small, rapid, and inconsistent with the baseline vibration of the surrounding terrain. It does not match any known safe signature stored in the elephant's memory. And for an animal weighing 6,000 kilograms, a foot injury is not a minor setback. An elephant cannot hobble on 3 legs while one heals. The physics of the body demand 4 functional contact points at all times. A deep puncture wound from a thorn driven into the fat pad can become infected within days in the bacterial landscape of the African savanna. A fractured toe bone hidden inside the cushioned pad can cripple the elephant's walking gait permanently. A puff adder bite between the toes, in the thin interdigital skin where the hide offers almost no barrier, delivers venom directly into a highly vascularized region. In the wild, a lame elephant is a dead elephant on a delayed schedule. It falls behind the herd during seasonal movements. It cannot reach distant water sources. It forages less efficiently, burning calories it cannot replace. Predators that would never approach a healthy adult elephant, particularly lions, begin testing a limping individual, probing for weakness. The decline is slow, sometimes taking weeks, but it is irreversible. So when an elephant detects unexpected ground-level movement near its foot, the response has nothing to do with identifying the creature. It has everything to do with the risk profile of the situation. The cost of stepping carefully around an unidentified small animal is essentially zero. A few extra strides. A brief detour. The cost of stepping through that disturbance and driving a thorn through the fat pad, or landing on a concealed snake, or triggering a defensive response from something the elephant did not identify in time, is potentially catastrophic. The math favors caution every single time. The mouse is not the threat. The mouse is the trigger for a threat avoidance system that evolved over millions of years to protect the single most critical structural interface between the elephant's body and the ground beneath it. If bees and mice are surprising entries on the list of things that worry elephants, the next one is even more unexpected. The relationship between African elephants and ants adds another dimension to the story entirely. In 2010, ecologist Todd Palmer at the University of Florida published a study in Current Biology documenting an ecological standoff that plays out daily across the grasslands of Kenya and Tanzania. The whistling thorn acacia, Acacia drepanalobium, is one of the most common trees dotting the East African savanna. It is also one of an elephant's preferred food sources. A single elephant can strip a mature whistling thorn acacia of its branches, bark, and leaves in a matter of minutes, using a trunk that generates enough pulling force to bend steel fencing wire. But the whistling thorn acacia has a defense contractor on permanent retainer. Chromatogaster ants, a genus of small, aggressive, foul-smelling ants sometimes called cocktail ants for the way they raise their abdomens when agitated, colonize the hollow, swollen thorns that give the tree its name. They live inside the thorns, feeding on nectar the tree produces specifically to sustain them. In exchange, the ants attack any herbivore that touches their host tree. When an elephant begins feeding on a whistling thorn acacia, the ants pour out of their thorn shelters by the hundreds, streaming onto the elephant's trunk, face, and lip margins, and biting the thin mucosal tissue inside the nostrils and around the eyes. The individual bites are not individually dangerous, but the chemical compounds the ants release create an intensely irritating burning sensation on soft tissue, and the sheer number of ants makes the trunk functionally unusable until the elephant retreats and clears its airways. Palmer's experiments were definitive. He removed ant colonies from a subset of experimental acacia trees while leaving neighboring trees fully defended. Elephants began feeding on the cleared trees immediately while continuing to avoid ant-occupied trees standing just meters away. The ants, each one weighing a tiny fraction of a gram, far less than a single grain of rice, were successfully deterring the largest land animal on the planet from eating their tree. And no, I'm not making that up. The mass ratio between a bull elephant and a single chromatogaster ant is in the range of several billion to 1, and the ant wins. The mechanism is identical in every case. The ants cannot kill the elephant, they cannot even cause lasting injury, but they can access the trunk, the nostrils, the eyelids, the places where the elephant's armor is thinnest, and its nerve density is highest. The calories the elephant would gain from eating one ant-defended tree are simply not worth the cost of having several hundred ants burrowing into its nasal passages for the next hour. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. I cover animal evolution and natural history every week. While all of this research on bees, ants, and small creature avoidance was accumulating in the behavioral ecology literature, a separate line of investigation was revealing something even more striking about what elephants fear. Because the most dangerous small creature an elephant encounters is not an insect and not a rodent, it is a human being. In 2014, behavioral ecologists Karen McComb and Graham Shannon at the University of Sussex published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that documented one of the most sophisticated threat assessment capabilities ever observed in a non-human animal. Working with wild elephant families in Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya, where the broad, dust-colored plain stretched toward the snow-capped peak of Mount Kilimanjaro on the horizon, McComb and Shannon played recordings of human voices through concealed speakers placed near known elephant pathways. The recordings were simple conversational phrases spoken by members of different demographic categories: Maasai men, Kamba men, Maasai women, Maasai boys. The demographic distinction was critical because of history. The Maasai are semi-nomadic pastoralists whose herds of cattle compete directly with elephants for grazing and water across East Africa. For generations, Maasai warriors have demonstrated courage by confronting elephants with spears, and elephants living in Maasai territory have been harassed, wounded, and killed by adult Maasai men more frequently than by any other category of human. The Kamba people, by contrast, are primarily agricultural and have far less direct physical conflict with elephants. The elephants' responses were precisely calibrated to these historical realities. When they heard recordings of adult Maasai men speaking, family groups clustered defensively around their youngest calves, moved rapidly away from the speaker location, and engaged in investigatory behavior, extending their trunks toward the sound source to sample the air for chemical cues. When they heard Kamba men speaking the same types of phrases in a different language, the response was markedly weaker, often amounting to a brief period of alertness, followed by a return to normal feeding behavior. When they heard Maasai women and boys, the response fell between the two extremes, more cautious than the Kamba baseline, but less urgent than the adult male reaction. The elephants were not simply responding to human voice as a single threat category. They were parsing the acoustic information embedded in the recordings, distinguishing between languages, genders, and approximate age groups based on pitch, timbre, and cadence, and calibrating their fear response in proportion to the assessed threat level of each specific demographic. Pay attention to that, because it explains a great deal about how elephant fear actually works. These animals were making probability judgments. They were weighing evidence. They had learned, through direct experience spanning decades and through culturally transmitted knowledge passed within their family groups, that adult Maasai men represent the highest probability threat among all the categories of humans they encounter, and they adjusted their behavior for every other category relative to that peak. No other non-human animal has demonstrated this level of specificity and threat discrimination from vocal cues alone, all of which leads to the single most important variable in the entire elephant fear response, the matriarch. African elephant herds are organized around a dominant older female who leads the family group across its home range. The matriarch is not the largest member of the herd. She is rarely the strongest. She is the oldest, and her value to the group is not measured in physical capacity. It is measured in knowledge. The African elephant brain weighs roughly 5 kilograms, about 4 times the mass of a human brain. It is the largest brain of any land animal that has ever existed. Larger than any dinosaur brain ever discovered. Larger than the brains of the extinct mammoths and mastodons that preceded modern elephants. The temporal lobes, which process auditory information and contribute to long-term memory storage, are proportionally enormous. The hippocampus, the brain region most directly associated with the encoding and retrieval of spatial memory and episodic experience, is highly developed and densely folded, packed with more neural connections per cc than in most mammals. In 2001, Karen McComb, a decade before the voice discrimination study, published earlier research demonstrating that the age of the matriarch directly predicted how well a herd assessed social threats. McComb played recordings of unfamiliar elephant calls to family groups, led by matriarchs of varying ages, and measured how accurately the herds discriminated between familiar and unfamiliar individuals. The results were unambiguous. Herds led by matriarchs over 55 years old correctly identified and responded to unfamiliar elephant calls more than 80% of the time. Herds led by matriarchs under 35 performed at roughly 40%, barely better than chance. The older the matriarch, the more accurately the herd assessed threats, and the more appropriately they calibrated their response. 5 years later, in 2006, a team led by Joshua Plotnick at Emory University, working alongside the renowned primatologist Franz de Waal and cognitive researcher Deanna Rice, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that pushed elephant cognition into even more extraordinary territory. They demonstrated that Asian elephants can recognize themselves in mirrors. The experimental setup was straightforward but demanding. Large mirrors were placed in the elephant's enclosure. Visible marks were painted on parts of the elephants, bodies that they could only see by using the mirror. The elephants touched the marks on their own bodies while looking at their reflections, proving that they understood the image in the mirror was themselves, not another animal. Mirror self-recognition is a cognitive test that only a handful of species have ever passed: great apes, bottlenose dolphins, orcas, Eurasian magpies, and elephants. The capacity implies the existence of a mental model of one's own body, including its spatial dimensions, its physical form, and, potentially, its vulnerabilities. An animal that recognizes its own reflection can, in principle, anticipate which parts of its body are most exposed and protect those areas preferentially. The matriarch combines all of this cognitive architecture with 6 or 7 decades of accumulated experience. She remembers which water holes went dry during the drought 20 years ago. She remembers which migration corridors brought the herd too close to Maasai settlements. She remembers the location of a bee colony that stung 2 of her calves when they were young, 15 or 20 years earlier. She remembers the sound of a specific vehicle engine that once accompanied human hunters. She carries a living map of threats, resources, and safe passages that encompasses hundreds of square kilometers and spans more than half a century of observation. And when the herd encounters an unfamiliar stimulus on the ground, whether it is a mouse scurrying through dry grass, a tortoise retracting into its shell, or a pile of leaves that shifted in the wind, it is the matriarch's assessment that determines the collective response. Her decision transmits through the herd in seconds, carried on infrasonic rumbles that propagate simultaneously through the air and through the ground. The younger elephants do not need to independently evaluate the threat. They read the matriarch's reaction and mirror it. If she walks forward with confidence, the herd follows. If she redirects, the herd turns. If she signals alarm, the herd clusters around the calves and moves away. The avoidance behavior you see when an elephant encounters a mouse is not a simple startle reflex. It is the visible output of a decision-making architecture that incorporates the matriarch's lifetime of stored threat data, simultaneous inputs from at least 4 separate sensory systems, the social context of the herd's current state, and an implicit cost-benefit calculation about the consequences of ignoring versus avoiding the unknown stimulus. There is one more dimension to this system that most people have never encountered, both literally and in a figurative sense. Elephants communicate and perceive their environment partly through infrasound, acoustic vibrations at frequencies below 20 Hz, below the lower boundary of human hearing. You could stand 2 meters from a rumbling elephant and hear nothing, while the elephant's family members 10 kilometers away receive the message clearly. An elephant's low-frequency call at 14 Hz propagates through the ground as a seismic wave, traveling at roughly 250 to 350 meters per second through typical savanna soil, faster than a commercial jet at takeoff. These waves can reach other elephants at distances exceeding 10 kilometers, roughly the distance from one end of Manhattan to the other. O'Connell-Rodwell documented a distinctive behavior she termed foot lifting during her field studies in Etosha. When an elephant detects a faint or ambiguous seismic signal arriving through the ground, it will raise one front foot slightly off the earth and lean forward, pressing the remaining 3 feet more firmly into the soil. This posture increases the contact pressure on the Pacinian corpuscles in the grounded feet and allows the elephant to extract directional information from the incoming vibration. The elephant is, in a very real sense, pressing its ear to the ground. When a matriarch at one waterhole detects a threat, whether a pride of lions, a group of Maasai men, or an agitated colony of bees, she can transmit a seismic warning that reaches family members at a different waterhole several kilometers away, elephants who are too far away to hear her airborne vocalizations. The warning arrives through the ground before the threat itself can travel the same distance. The distant elephants, receiving the signal through their feet, begin adjusting their behavior before they have any direct evidence of danger. The elephant fear response is not an individual reaction contained within a single nervous system. It is a network event, distributed across multiple sensory channels, coordinated by the most experienced member of the group, transmitted through media that the threat itself usually cannot detect or interfere with, and calibrated to the specific nature, probability, and severity of the danger. So why did 60 million years of natural selection build an animal this cautious? Why not simply make the elephant tougher, thicker-skinned across every surface, and neurologically indifferent to small creatures that pose no realistic chance of killing it? The answer is embedded in the mathematics of reproductive investment, and once you understand the numbers, the elephant's caution stops looking like a flaw and starts looking like the most rational strategy in the animal kingdom. A female African elephant reaches sexual maturity between the ages of 10 and 12. Her gestation period is 22 months, the longest of any land mammal, nearly twice the length of a human pregnancy. She will nurse her calf for 2 to 4 years. She will typically produce one calf every 4 to 6 years, with intensive maternal investment in each one. Across a productive lifespan of roughly 40 years, a single female might produce 8 to 10 calves total, of which perhaps half will survive to breeding age themselves. Compare those numbers to the mouse. A female house mouse reaches sexual maturity at roughly 6 weeks of age. Her gestation period is 20 days, shorter than most humans spend deciding what to watch on television. She can produce 5 to 10 litters per year, each containing 6 to 12 pups. In the time it takes a single elephant to gestate and nurse one calf, roughly 4 years of investment, a single mouse has the theoretical reproductive capacity to generate thousands of descendants. This difference in reproductive tempo is not a curiosity. It is the single most important variable in how evolution calibrates risk tolerance across species. For a mouse, an individual death is nearly invisible at the population level. The species replaces its losses faster than almost any predator can accumulate them. Mice can afford to be bold, even reckless, because the cost of losing one individual is instantly absorbed by the explosive reproductive output of every survivor. A mouse that takes risks and dies leaves behind siblings and cousins, producing dozens of replacements every few months. For an elephant, the equation inverts completely. Every adult is a massive biological investment. Years of gestation, years of nursing, years of learning from the matriarch, decades of accumulated ecological knowledge, encoded in a 5-kilogram brain that cannot be duplicated, transferred, or reconstructed. The death of a single breeding-age female does not just remove one individual from the population count. It removes a living library of survival information that took half a century to compile and will require another half-century to replace. Data from long-term elephant research projects across Africa has confirmed this repeatedly. Herds that lose their matriarch to poaching or drought show measurable declines in reproductive success, calf survival rates, and threat avoidance accuracy for years afterward. The gap left by the matriarch's death is not filled by the next oldest female stepping into the role. The knowledge that dies with the matriarch is gone, and the next generation rebuilds it only through slow, costly, sometimes fatal experience. This is why natural selection built elephants to be cautious. Not because timidity is inherently valuable, because the cost of losing an individual elephant to a preventable injury, measured in reproductive years destroyed and irreplaceable ecological knowledge erased, is higher than for almost any other mammal walking the African savanna. The elephant that walks a wide arc around an unidentified ground-level disturbance and wastes 10 extra steps is out nothing meaningful. The elephant that walks through the disturbance and drives a thorn deep into its footpad, or steps on a concealed puff adder, or triggers a defensive swarm from something it did not pause to identify, may be out its life. And with it, decades of accumulated survival knowledge that the herd cannot afford to lose. Evolution does not build fearless giants, it builds cautious ones. The fearless giants are gone. They left their bones in the sediment. The cautious ones left descendants. The Proboscidean lineage stretches back to the late Paleocene epoch. The earliest known member, a small ground-dwelling mammal called Erytherium, was discovered in Morocco in sediments approximately 60 million years old. It weighed about 5 kilograms, roughly the size of a domestic cat. It had no tusks, no trunk, no external resemblance to anything you would recognize walking the plains of Amboseli today. Over the next 60 million years, the lineage radiated into a staggering diversity of forms that colonized every continent except Australia and Antarctica. Dinotherium, with its bizarre downward curving tusks designed for bark stripping, stood nearly 5 meters at the shoulder, tall enough to look over a 2-story building, and roamed across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The woolly mammoth, Mammuthus primigenius, dominated the frozen steppes of northern Eurasia and North America for hundreds of thousands of years. Its dense undercoat and curving 4-meter tusks adapted to survive glacial winters that would kill an unprotected African elephant in hours. Paleoloxodon pneumaticus, a straight-tusked elephant that inhabited the Indian subcontinent during the Pleistocene, may have weighed over 20 tons, according to some estimates, heavier than 3 modern African bull elephants standing on the same scale. If those estimates hold, it was the largest land mammal that has ever lived. Of the roughly 180 proboscidean species that have existed since that 5-kilogram Erytherium nosed through Paleocene leaf litter in Morocco, 2 survive. The African elephant. The Asian elephant. Every other branch of the family tree is gone. Mammoths. Mastodons. Gomphotheres. Stegodons. All of them erased by some combination of climate shifts, habitat transformation, and, across the past 50,000 years, the expanding reach of human hunters carrying ever more effective weapons. The 2 species that remain are the most cautious, the most socially organized, the most cognitively sophisticated, and the most risk-averse of the entire lineage. They are the survivors of a 60-million-year selection filter that consistently rewarded intelligence, memory, social cooperation, and conservative threat assessment, while consistently punishing aggression, recklessness, and indifference to potential danger. This pattern is not unique to the Proboscidean lineage. Across the animal kingdom, the largest surviving species tend to exhibit the most elaborate and sensitive threat avoidance behaviors. Blue whales, the largest animals that have ever existed on Earth at up to 150 tons, the weight of roughly 25 adult African elephants, are deeply shy animals. They dive when vessels approach. They avoid areas of concentrated shipping traffic. They alter their migration routes in response to acoustic disturbance from sonar and industrial noise. They are, by disposition, among the most cautious animals in the ocean, despite having no natural predators at adult size. Great white sharks, apex predators weighing up to 200 kilograms heavier than a large SUV, will abandon productive hunting grounds entirely when orcas arrive. In 2019, a team led by Salvador Jorgensen at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute in California tracked white sharks at the Farallon Islands off the coast of San Francisco using satellite tags. When a pod of orcas entered the area, every tagged shark left. Not gradually over days, within hours. And the sharks did not return for months, long after the orcas had moved on and the seal colonies they both fed on were fully restocked. The brief presence of a competitor that the shark could theoretically confront triggered a seasonal abandonment of one of the richest hunting territories on the Pacific coast. The pattern repeats across taxonomic groups, across continents, across ocean basins. The largest animals are not the bravest, they are the most careful. And the evolutionary pressure driving that caution is always the same arithmetic. They reproduce slowly. They invest heavily in each individual. They cannot afford to lose adults to avoidable injuries or confrontations. Every miscalculation carries a cost that compounds across generations. So what is actually happening? in the full complexity of its neurobiology and evolutionary logic, when an African elephant encounters a mouse on a game trail. The elephant's Pacinian corpuscles detect a small, rapid seismic disturbance near one of its front feet. The signal is inconsistent with the baseline vibration of the surrounding soil. The visual system registers motion in the lower peripheral field, but cannot resolve the identity of the moving object at ground level. The olfactory system engages. The trunk swings forward and downward, sampling the air column between the elephant's face and the ground for chemical signatures. If the scent profile matches a known safe category stored in long-term memory, the alert response may subside. If the signature is unfamiliar or ambiguous, the avoidance protocol remains active. The auditory system scans the ambient soundscape for correlated threat signals. The buzz of a disturbed bee colony. The dry rasp of a snake's scales on soil. The distinctive vocal characteristics of adult Maasai men. If no additional threat indicators are present, the avoidance response stays moderate. A lateral step. A widened walking arc. If the matriarch is present and has assessed the situation as non-threatening, she continues forward and the herd follows her signal. If the matriarch signals uncertainty through a subtle shift in her gait or a low-frequency rumble pitched at the edge of detection, the younger elephants adjust their paths accordingly. If no matriarch signal arrives at all, the default is avoidance. The entire sequence unfolds in less than 2 seconds. It integrates inputs from at least 4 separate sensory systems operating simultaneously. It draws on long-term memory stores accumulated across decades. It factors in the social hierarchy and current behavioral state of the herd. And it runs a cost-benefit analysis calibrated by 60 million years of evolutionary pressure, comparing the trivial cost of walking around an unknown stimulus against the potentially catastrophic cost of stepping on or into something that damages a foot, a trunk, or any other structure the elephant cannot afford to lose. And from 20 meters away through the viewfinder of a camera, it looks exactly like a giant animal being scared of a tiny mouse. The question in the title of this video assumes that fear should be proportional to size, that an animal 300,000 times heavier than a mouse should be untroubled by its presence, that a 6-ton giant should move through the world without hesitation or caution. But evolution does not reward indifference. Evolution rewards precision. And the elephant's fear response is not a glitch in its programming, it is the program. 60 million years of selection pressure produced an animal that treats every unidentified ground-level disturbance as a potential cost, because the mathematics of slow reproduction and high individual investment make the consequences of a preventable injury more severe for an elephant than for almost any other animal alive. The elephant does not fear the mouse. The elephant respects the uncertainty the mouse represents. And that willingness to pause, to assess, to choose caution, when the stakes of being wrong outweigh the cost of being careful, is the behavioral signature that has kept the proboscidean lineage alive across 60 million years of climate catastrophes, habitat collapses, and mass extinction events, while the bold, the indifferent, and the reckless left nothing behind but fossils. What endures is not the largest animal or the strongest or the most aggressive. What endures is the one that knows when to walk around. If you want to see how the largest animals on Earth have used intelligence instead of brute force to outlast threats that erased entire species, click the video on screen now.